Dawn crept through the stone archways of High Spire Roost like an unwelcome guest, painting the nesting caverns in shades of amber and ash. Theron pulled his worn leather coat tighter against the morning chill as he made his rounds through the hatching chambers. His boots scraped against ancient stone, each step echoing the loneliness that had become his constant companion since his fall from grace. The Imperial Dragon Roost stretched across 3 mountain peaks, a monument to centuries of breeding the finest war dragons in the realm. Theron had once walked these halls as headkeeper, respected and feared in equal measure. Now he cleaned the lower chambers, the ones reserved for clutches deemed unworthy of the royal eye. He paused at Chamber 7. Where the morning shift had left the heavy iron door slightly ajar? Strange. The handlers never left doors open. Dragons, even newborns, possessed instincts sharper than any blade. Theron pushed the door wider and stepped inside. The nesting chamber sprawled before him, circular and vast, with 12 stone cradles arranged around a central warming pit. 11 cradles sat empty, their silk bedding torn and scattered. In the 12th, something moved. The broken one, she was small. Too small. Where her clutch mates had emerged the size of warhorses, this hatchling barely reached Theron's knee. Her scales, which should have gleamed like polished obsidian, looked dull and mismatched. Patches of deep purple interrupted the black, creating a mottled pattern that spoke of genetic chaos. One wing hung crooked, the membrane torn from some struggle Theron could only imagine, but her eyes blazed with an intelligence that made Theron's breath catch. They were violet, shot through with threads of silver, and they tracked his every movement with desperate awareness. Around her lay the remnants of her shell. Unlike the clean breaks of successful hatchings, her egg had shattered violently. Pieces scattered across the cradle like broken promises. Scratch marks scored the stone, some still wet with blood. Her blood. The other hatchlings had attacked her. It happened sometimes when a clutch sensed weakness. Nature's cruelty dressed up as survival instinct. Theron knelt slowly, keeping his hands visible and empty. The hatchling's throat pulsed with a warning rumble, but exhaustion weighed down her defiance. She had fought her siblings, fought her way out of a malformed egg, and now faced another threat. Him. Easy now, Theron whispered, his voice carrying the gentle cadence he once used with the finest dragons in the kingdom. I know what it feels like to be cast aside. The choice footsteps thundered in the corridor outside. Theron recognized the heavy tread of Commander Draxis, the Roost's military overseer. The man possessed all the warmth of winter iron and half the flexibility. There you are. Draxis filled the doorway, his crimson uniform immaculate despite the early hour. 2 guards flanked him, their expressions carefully neutral. I see you found our little problem. Theron stood slowly, positioning himself between Draxis and the hatchling. She needs medical attention. That wing requires proper setting, and those wounds need cleaning. Draxis laughed, a sound like rocks grinding together. Medical attention. For that? He gestured dismissively at the hatchling. The culling should have happened in the egg. Sometimes nature needs assistance finishing its work. The words hit Theron like physical blows. Culling. They meant to kill her simply for being different. And she's viable, Theron argued, hearing the desperation creep into his voice. Look at her eyes. Look at that bone structure beneath the irregularities. With proper care, she could thrive. With proper care, she would embarrass the Imperial bloodlines. Draxis stepped forward, one hand resting on the ornate dagger at his belt. You forget yourself, Keeper. Or should I say former Keeper. Your opinions lost their value when you lost your position. The reminder stung, as Draxis intended. 2 years ago, Theron had defied the breeding protocols to save a dragon showing signs of a genetic disorder. He had been right. The dragon, Scorvax, now served as one of the Queen's personal guard. But rules mattered more than results in the Imperial bureaucracy. Theron's reward for success had been demotion and disgrace. Step aside, Draxis ordered. The guards will handle disposal. The bond begins. Something shifted in Theron's chest. A familiar fire he thought the bureaucrats had fully extinguished. He looked at the hatchling, saw her trembling with fear and pain, and made his choice. No, the word hung in the air like a thrown gauntlet. Draxis's expression shifted from annoyance to genuine surprise. What did you say? I said no. Theron moved closer to the cradle, his body language clear, protective, final. I invoke the right of compassion. Draxis's face flushed red. You cannot be serious. That law is archaic, meant for times when dragons were rare. We have hundreds of viable hatchlings this season alone. The law stands regardless of your convenience. Theron met the commander's glare without flinching. The right of compassion allows any keeper, regardless of rank, to claim stewardship of a dragon scheduled for culling. I claim this hatchling. She is mine to care for, and you cannot touch her without breaking Imperial law. Behind him, the hatchling made a sound. Not a growl, not a whimper. Something between the two. A note of confused hope that pierced straight through Theron's carefully maintained emotional armor. Draxis sputtered, his hand clenching and unclenching on his dagger hilt. But law was law, even when inconvenient. You are making a grave mistake, Theron. When that creature fails, and it will fail, you will bear full responsibility. No resources. No support. And when it dies, your name dies with it. Then I will die standing, Theron replied quietly. The commander spun on his heel and stormed from the chamber, his guards scrambling to follow. The door slammed with enough force to rattle the warming pit's metal grating. In the sudden silence, Theron turned to face his new responsibility. The hatchling watched him with those impossible violet eyes, waiting to see if this was another betrayal or something different, something new. Theron extended his hand slowly, palm up, fingers relaxed. An invitation without demands. I am going to name you Vesra, he said softly. It means the one who endures in the old tongue. Together we are going to prove them all wrong. Vesra tilted her head, considering. Then, with movements painful in their caution, she stretched her neck forward. Her scaled snout touched his palm, warm and alive and trusting. And in that moment, beneath the weight of scorn and impossible odds, something remarkable began. Morning light filtered through the skylights of Theron's private quarters, a cramped stone room behind the lower stables that smelled of hay and old leather. He had converted half the space into a makeshift infirmary for Vesra, hanging thick curtains to retain warmth, and stacking crates to create barriers that might help her feel secure. 3 weeks had passed since he claimed her. 3 weeks of sleepless nights, stolen medical supplies, and whispered consultations with the few keepers who still spoke to him. Vesra lay curled in a nest of blankets, her breathing finally steady and deep. The wounds from her siblings had closed, leaving pale scars that traced stories across her mismatched scales. Her wing remained the greatest challenge. Theron had set it as best he could, splinting the damaged membrane with flexible willow branches and silk thread. Each day he massaged the joint, working carefully to prevent the muscles from atrophying. Vesra endured these sessions with remarkable patience, though her tail would lash when the pain grew too intense. "Good morning, little warrior," Theron murmured, setting down a bucket of fresh water in a sack containing 3 rabbits from the kitchen surplus. Vesra's eyes opened immediately, that distinctive violet glow focusing on him with an intensity that still took his breath away. She chirped, a sound like wind chimes made of bone, and struggled to her feet. The movement remained awkward, her body learning to compensate for the crooked wing. But determination burned in every gesture. Theron smiled despite his exhaustion. "Hungry, of course you are?" Growing dragons are always hungry. Prepared her meal with practiced efficiency, cutting the meat into portions appropriate for her size. Vesra had surprised him by showing a preference for variety. Unlike most hatchlings who would devour anything placed before them, she investigated each piece, sometimes rejecting offerings that other dragons would consider delicacies. As she ate, Theron studied her carefully. Her growth, while slower than her clutch mates, proceeded steadily. More importantly, her mind developed at an accelerated rate. She understood commands after a single demonstration, and had already learned to recognize her name, its name, and several basic instructions. Yesterday, she had figured out how to unlatch the makeshift gate he used to keep her safe while he worked. Intelligence. Like that was dangerous in the Imperial Roost, where dragons were valued for obedience above all else. The confrontation, a sharp knock, interrupted his thoughts. Before Theron could respond, Commander Draxis pushed through the door, his expression carved from ice and irritation. "Your pet project needs to vacate these quarters," Draxis announced without preamble. "We require the space for legitimate operations." Theron stood slowly, positioning himself between the commander and Vesra. "These are my assigned quarters. You have no authority to reassign them. I have every authority." Draxis pulled a scroll from his belt, letting it unroll with theatrical precision. New regulations from the Royal Council. All dragons, regardless of status, must be housed in designated training facilities, your hatchling included. The implications crashed over Theron like a cold wave. Training facilities meant exposure to other dragons, handlers who viewed Vesra as defective, and protocols designed to break rather than nurture. She would not survive a week. "She is not ready for communal housing," Theron argued, fighting to keep his voice level. "Her injuries require continued private care." Draxis stepped closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Let me be clear, Fallen Keeper. The Council tolerates your right of compassion, because old laws bind even their hands. But laws can be interpreted. One complaint about disruption, one incident of aggression, one failure to meet training standards, and I will have grounds to override your claim. That creature will be cold, and you will be expelled from the roost entirely." Behind Theron, Vesra growled. The sound started low, a vibration that resonated through the stone floor, then built into something that made the water in the bucket ripple. Her violet eyes fixed on Draxis with an expression beyond her age, beyond her size. Ancient hatred recognizing ancient cruelty, Draxis's hand moved to his dagger. "Control your animal, or I will do it for you." Vesra, calm/Theron commanded, putting force behind the word. He felt her resistance, the desire to defend him warring with trust in his judgment. For a heartbeat, the outcome balanced on a knife's edge. Then Vesra's growl faded. She lowered her head, but her eyes never left Draxis. The message was clear. Today she would obey. Tomorrow might tell a different story. Draxis sneered, but Theron saw the flicker of unease in the commander's expression. He had seen it too. That flash of intelligence, that moment of choice. Dragons were not supposed to think. They were supposed to react. "You have 3 days to relocate," Draxis said, recovering his composure. "I suggest you spend that time teaching it proper submission. The training yards show no mercy to defiance." He left without waiting for a response, his boots echoing down the corridor like a countdown. The discovery that evening. Theron took Vesra to the abandoned eastern tower. Few visited this section of the roost. Crumbling stonework and unstable floors made it dangerous for anyone without wings. But Theron knew the safe paths. Vesra needed space to move without judgment. They climbed the open platform at the tower's peak. Wind whipped through the ruins, carrying the scent of pine forests and distant rain. Below, the valley spread out in darkening greens and golds, while above, the first stars pierced the twilight. Vesra limped to the edge, her good wings spreading instinctively to catch the breeze. The damaged one twitched but remained folded, the splint preventing full extension. Frustration radiated from her small frame. "I know," Theron said softly, joining her at the precipice. "You want to fly? All dragons do. It is written in your bones, burned into your blood." Vesra turned those remarkable eyes on him, and Theron felt the weight of her question. "Will I ever fly? Can something broken be made whole?" He knelt beside her, running his hand along her scales. "The truth is, I do not know if your wing will heal enough for traditional flight. The damage runs deep. But Vesra, flying is not the only way to soar." She cocked her head, confused. Theron pointed to the sky, where a falcon circled on thermal currents. "That bird flies with wings. But watch." He shifted his finger to indicate an eagle owl settling on a nearby outcropping. "That hunter flies with silence." And there he gestured to a formation of starlings, weaving impossible patterns through the air. They fly with cooperation. Each finds their own way to touch the sky, as if responding to his words. Something shifted in the air around them. Theron felt it first as a tingling along his skin, like static before a storm. Vesra's scales began to shimmer, the mismatched colors suddenly luminous in the fading light. The purple patches glowed with an inner fire, while the black areas seemed to absorb the very air around them. Theron breathed, wonder replacing his exhaustion. Vesra's eyes blazed brighter. The wind around them began to swirl, not chaotically, but with purpose. It gathered beneath her, lifting her slightly off the stone. Not flight, not exactly, but something else. Something the breeding protocols had never anticipated. She was manipulating the air itself. The display lasted only moments before Vesra collapsed, panting from the effort. But those moments changed everything. Theron gathered her close, feeling her rapid heartbeat against his chest. "You magnificent creature," he whispered. "They called you broken because you do not fit their expectations. But you are not broken. You are something new, something they are too frightened to understand." Vesra chirped softly, exhaustion giving way to contentment. She curled against him, trusting him to keep her safe, while she recovered her strength. As darkness claimed the valley, Theron made a silent promise. He would not let the training yards crush her spirit. He would not let Draxis's cruelty define her worth. Whatever it took, he would help Vesra become what she was meant to be, even if it meant standing against the entire empire far below. In the main compound, Commander Draxis watched the eastern tower through a spyglass. He had seen the light show, witnessed the impossible display. His jaw tightened with determination. Genetic aberrations were meant to be cold before they could spread, before they could inspire dangerous ideas in the lower ranks, before they could prove that perhaps the old ways were not the only ways. He lowered the spyglass and turned to his aide. "Double the patrols around the eastern sector, and send word to the capital. The council needs to know we have a situation developing, one that requires immediate attention." The aide saluted and hurried away, leaving Draxis alone with his thoughts and his certainty. Theron and his pet had just made their final mistake. The culling would happen after all. It would just require more planning than anticipated. Rain hammered against the roost's ancient stones with the fury of a spurned sky. Theron jolted awake in the training facility's communal keeper quarters, his heart already racing before his mind identified the threat. Someone was shaking his shoulder with urgent intensity. "Theron, wake up." The voice belonged to Grandmother Isla, the oldest keeper in the roost. Her face a roadmap of 60 years spent among dragons. "They are coming for Vesra, tonight." He sat up immediately, pulling on his boots. Even as sleep fled his eyes. "What are you talking about?" "We completed every evaluation. Vesra exceeded the minimum standards." Ila's expression held the sadness of someone delivering news she wished she could unsay. Draxis convinced the council she poses a genetic threat. They approved an emergency culling order. The execution squad gathers as we speak. The words hit like physical blows. Theron's hands fumbled with his bootlaces, rage and fear making his fingers clumsy. 6 weeks had passed since their move to the training yards. 6 weeks of Vesra, proving herself capable, intelligent, and utterly unique. She could not fly, but her control over air currents had developed beyond anything Theron had imagined. She could deflect attacks, create barriers of compressed wind, and sense approaching storms hours before any weather instrument. None of that mattered to men who valued conformity over capability. "How long do I have?" Theron asked, already moving toward the door. "Minutes, perhaps?" They waited for the storm, hoping the noise would cover the deed. Isla pressed a small leather pouch into his hands. "Travel rations and coin. Head for the Freelands. The dragon riders there care more about what a creature can do than what bloodline it carries." Theron gripped her shoulders, gratitude and desperation warring in his chest. "Thank you. For everything." "Save her," Isla commanded, her voice fierce despite her age. "Save her and prove that broken things can still be beautiful." He ran. The training facility occupied the roost's western wing. A series of reinforced chambers designed to contain adolescent dragons. Vesra's cell lay at the end of the corridor, isolated from the others at Draxis's insistence. That isolation meant his punishment now became their salvation. Theron skidded to a halt before the heavy iron door. His hands shook as he worked the lock, precious seconds bleeding away with each fumbled attempt. Finally, the mechanism clicked. He hauled the door open and found Vesra awake, her violet eyes reflecting the torchlight like twin moons. She had grown. No longer the tiny hatchling he had claimed, she now stood as tall as his chest. Her body lean and muscular despite the persistent irregularity of her scales. The splint had come off her wing 2 weeks ago, though the membrane remained scarred and incomplete. "We need to leave," Theron said, his voice urgent but controlled. Panic would only transfer to her. "Right now. Can you move quietly?" Vesra's response came not in sound, but in action. She flowed from the cell with liquid grace, her footfalls silent despite her size. That intelligence, that terrible, wonderful intelligence, understood the danger before he could explain it. They moved through the facility's service corridors, paths meant for handlers and supplies rather than official business. Theron's knowledge of the Roost's architecture, earned through years of service, guided them toward the delivery gates. If they could reach the mountain pass, they might disappear into the wilderness before Draxis could organize a proper pursuit. Voices echoed behind them. The execution squad had reached Vesra's cell and found it empty. "Faster," Theron urged, breaking into a run. They burst through a side exit into the storm's full fury. Rain lashed at them with vindictive force, turning the world into a gray chaos of water and wind. Theron oriented himself by memory and instinct, leading Vesra toward the servant's path that wound down the mountain's eastern face. A crossbow bolt buried itself in the stone beside his head. Theron threw himself flat, pulling Vesra down with him. 5 guards emerged from the storm, their waterproof cloaks whipping in the wind. Commander Draxis walked among them, a sword naked in his hand. "Did you really think you could steal Imperial property?" Draxis shouted over the storm's roar. "That creature belongs to the crown. You are nothing but a thief and a traitor." Theron positioned himself in front of Vesra, his body a shield despite knowing how inadequate flesh would prove against steel and crossbows. "She is not property. She is alive. She thinks and feels and deserves a chance to exist. She is an abomination. Guards, kill the dragon. The keeper can watch before he joins her." The crossbows lifted. Time crystallized into terrible clarity. Theron saw the fingers tightening on triggers, saw death approaching on iron-tipped vectors, and knew he had failed. Then Vesra roared. The revelation, the sound transcended mere noise. It carried power, authority, and something fundamental that spoke to the storm itself. The wind answered her call like a lover responding to invitation. It gathered around them in a spiraling wall, deflecting the crossbow bolts into harmless trajectories. But Vesra did not stop there. Her scarred wings spread wide, the damaged membrane glowing with that distinctive purple light. The intact wing mirrored the motion, and together they created something impossible. The wind did not just obey her, it became her. She lifted from the ground, not through traditional flight, but through pure manipulation of the air itself. The wind cradled her, supported her, carried her as naturally as water carries a fish. Her wings served not as lifting surfaces but as rudders, directing currents that her will commanded. The guards stumbled backward, their certainty evaporating in the face of something their training had never prepared them for. Even Draxis's sword lowered as he stared at the impossible sight. Vesra descended to hover beside Theron, her eyes meeting his with a question he understood perfectly. "Trust me." He had claimed her when everyone else demanded her death. He had tended her wounds when protocol said to let her suffer. He had believed in her when the entire empire declared her worthless. Now she offered to return the faith. Theron grabbed the ridge of her neck and pulled himself onto her back. His weight barely registered as the wind adjusted, compensating instantly for the additional burden. "This is not over." Draxis screamed, his face purple with rage. "You cannot run forever. The Empire will hunt you to the edges of the world." Vesra's response came not in words, but in action. She swept her wings in a complex pattern, and the storm responded with enthusiasm. A concentrated gust slammed into the guards, sending them sprawling across the muddy ground. Not lethal, but emphatic. A message delivered in wind and will. Then they rose. Up through the rain, up past the roost's highest towers, up into the wild sky, where rules and prejudice could not follow. Theron clung to Vesra's neck, rain and tears mixing on his face as laughter bubbled up from somewhere deep in his chest. Below, the roost shrank to toy size. The training yards, the nesting caverns, the halls where he had once walked with pride and purpose, all became small and distant, his old life falling away like a snake sheds skin. Vesra's joy resonated through her entire body, a vibration that spoke of freedom discovered and chains broken. She banked through the storm with increasing confidence, her unique method of flight allowing maneuvers no traditional dragon could match. The wind was not just her tool, it was her partner, her element, her home. "Where do we go?" Theron shouted, though he suspected she could not answer. But Vesra surprised him. She angled toward the east, where the storm thinned and dawn threatened the horizon. Toward the freelands where Grandmother Isla had suggested. Toward a future undefined by other people's expectations. As the first rays of sunlight broke through the clouds, they painted Vesra's mismatched scales in shades of gold and lavender. The colors that the breeders had called defective now looked like art, like purpose, like something deliberately chosen rather than accidentally created. Theron understood then what Vesra had been trying to show him all along. She was not a failed dragon. She was not a broken copy of something that should have been perfect. She was the first of something new, a bridge between the old ways and possibilities no one had yet imagined. Far behind them, in the roost's highest tower, Grandmother Isla watched the distant speck disappear into the morning. She smiled, her old eyes bright with satisfaction. "Fly, little warrior," she whispered. "Fly and show them all what broken things can become when given the chance." The storm passed. The sun rose, and somewhere in the vast expanse of freedom, disgraced keeper and a despised hatchling began writing their own story, one gust of wind at a time. In the roost, Commander Draxis issued orders for pursuit. But in his heart, beneath the anger and wounded pride, a tiny seed of doubt had taken root. What if they had been wrong? What if different did not mean lesser? The question would haunt him for the rest of his days, unanswered and unanswerable. A reminder that some truths reveal themselves only to those brave enough to look beyond the surface. And in the wild spaces beyond civilization's borders, two outcasts found something more valuable than acceptance. They found each other, and in doing so, discovered that the strongest bonds form not despite our imperfections, but because of them.